But basically, let's start with the big difference between experts and beginners is experts have lots of long-term memory. Experts have developed very powerful mental representations in things regarding the activities or areas of specialty that they're experts in, whereas novices don't have those mental representations yet. Can you talk a little bit about that as a concept, as a broad brush stroke?
Sure, no problem. So, first of all, there is a difference between experts and novices, meaning there are some people who have a large amount of experience who can do domain relevant things much better than ordinary people who are not experienced in the domain. So, that's probably recognizable by most people, but it's important to take note of. And then, what is it about them? And yeah, basically the cognitive sciences found that it's not that it's not simply a case of, well, if you adopt the right attitude or something, you can immediately behave like an expert. You do need to have a certain kind of knowledge gained usually through long experience of learning and often doing things in the domain. When we're using this word mental representations, is basically trying to express the idea that this knowledge has a certain structure. And I mean, one example that I can offer, which I think is probably quite accessible, is if you think about what knowledge is contained in learning a language. It's essentially there's some aspects of things like phonetics, so you need to know what it sounds like, because that's certainly an important thing, but we can leave that aside mostly. So that the most important things really about learning a language are vocabulary and grammar. But we don't teach people vocabulary and grammar, or you don't try to learn vocabulary and grammar by reading a dictionary. Despite the fact that a dictionary contains the words and their definitions, nobody would do that, and if you try to do that, it would be very inefficient. And also, the vocabulary of an expert is not much like a dictionary. Like, they won't be able to list the words for you in alphabetical order. They haven't actually got access to all of the words unless they're in some specific, within some specific context. Suddenly, lots of words will appear to them, but outside of that context, it kind of depends what you're talking about, and then they'll have more words for the topic you're talking about. So essentially what I'm saying is that a person's vocabulary is unlike a dictionary, despite the fact that, like a dictionary, it's a set of all the words. So how is that possible, that it's both a set of all the words but it's not like a dictionary? The difference is that it's structured differently to how the dictionary is structured. And that's part of this idea of mental representations, that excuse me, it's part of the idea of mental representations that it's not just about having the knowledge, but it's important to recognize that the knowledge has a certain shape or a certain structure, that there are relationships between memories, effectively, or things that that make up part of what it means to be an expert.
And so number one, there would be one group of people who I think are kind of learning dictionaries by heart, which is Scrabble players. Like, Scrabble players have a
they're a
very, very
special case.
particular
Yeah, I mean,
kind
they're
of
not going to be.
expertise.
Yeah.
There has been one very famous Scrabble player, I forgot the name, who's actually the French Scrabble master without speaking French, because he literally
Right.
just learned the dictionary. So that's what he did.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really know how he did that, but that's not what a normal person would be able to do. I mean,
No, but
he's
it's
either got a special technique, or there's something going on there. I don't know what it is.
yeah, but it's interesting that such a person also exists.
Yeah.
So I really like the point about knowledge is structured in a certain way, and
Mm.
one of the things I've been wrestling with a lot is, in reading all these texts about education and learning and teaching, people use mental representation, schema, knowledge, and they use all of these terms, and depending on which author you read, they kind of mean the same. And a
Mm.
schema is a mental representation, and it's been difficult to figure out what exactly do these words actually refer to. But for me, I came up with a similar definition to what you just had about knowledge is structured in a certain way, and these mental representations, and I use that word because it seems more accessible to me than the word schema, which I think a lot of people are kind of like, what does that even mean? These mental representations are structured around whatever the field of expertise is. So in the example of language, you have these unconscious structures because nobody knows how is my language structured. And it contains words and rules, but it also contains when do I use a certain word? How would I emphasize a word in a sentence? Like there are all of these little minute rules, skills, knowledge, attitudes, behaviors that are connected to the language. And all of that is kind of condensed and compressed in these mental representations that experts have.
Yeah, I actually have trouble with that as well. It's not very often that you see people try to define these. Where I have seen people try to strictly distinguish between schemas and mental representations, they usually describe schemas as ad hoc, small, sort of connected pieces of information, whereas mental representations often are more conscious and larger. That's not really enough to be that I mean, it's not enough for me to say that this is a very clear distinction, but I guess I have the similar experience to you in that when people use words like knowledge, mental representation, schema, to some extent even chunk, although chunk is a little bit better defined.
Chunk or pattern, even pattern sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, all these things they're a bit slippery. Like it's not clear what people are really talking about. Chunk gets better defined partly because some of the people who worked some of this stuff out, they do it by using computational models. So they basically write a computer program which is supposed to represent the kind of like it's essentially a computer program that does sorry, I'm not sure how best to say this, but in most of science, you would use a mathematical model to make precise what you're talking about. You're saying like, I have a theory about how this thing works, and I can express it using equations. So that would be a mathematical model. But a computational model is like, I have a theory about this, how this works, and I can express it using a computer program. So that they use these computer programs, and basically what they do is you set up, okay, here's a situation where a person is learning this thing, for example. Here are the steps of thought that they would go through. Here's how long each of those thoughts would take. Things like that. They basically write an algorithm that like does all those steps because it expresses their ideas of like, this is how I think the actual thinking would happen. So when people make those kinds of computer programs, similarly to when people write mathematical models in science, when they create mathematical equations to model reality, to express what they think reality is, then you have to be really, really precise. So, and those people do have, they defined what a chunk is in this way that's like algorithmic or like related to their software. So it is actually precisely defined within their software. I can't remember the exact definition, but it means that chunk does actually have a definition if you find out how they
one article.
Yeah. But unfortunately I don't remember it off the top of my head, but
one of the distinctions I ran across in medical training was the distinction between a schema and a framework, which I actually found very interesting to be. They made the big distinction about a framework is the conscious representation of a schema that can only always represent the conscious building blocks of a schema, which also contains lots of unconscious, perceptive, etc. elements. So I found that a helpful distinction as well. But so basically, to get back to mental representations, we just use that word and we kind of refer to that whole group of terms. Experts have very well-structured mental representations in their field of expertise.
Yes.
And due to these mental representations, they can perceive, reason in ways that non-experts that do not have these well-structured mental representations cannot. And one of the things I would love to talk about before we go into an example is Or actually, let's go into an example before we do that, because I think one of the most well-structured examples would be chess. So there used to be the idea that because people saw chess players do these crazy things like play 10 games blindfolded and uh, remember whole sequences of games and be able to look at a board for 5 seconds and recreate the whole board from memory. There used to be this idea of, oh God, chess players must be really smart and they must have great memories. And also we all kind of, probably also due to popular media, we kind of look at chess as this highly intelligent sport where only the geniuses are able to persist. And so that was the theory for a long time. But then actually, very well structured experiments came about that realized, hey, chess players don't have some magical memory, they don't have some magical intelligence, but actually what they have done is they have practiced this chess specific positions and setups and strategies so much that they have certain chunks, we're back to the word chunk, certain patterns that will happen on a chessboard regularly, stored in their long-term memory as whole sequences, and they are able to recognize those where you and I would guess, we both play probably a bit of chess, but we're not that good, that we would recognize all of these chunks. We would see, okay, this rook is there and this bishop is there, whereas they would see, oh, it's the Sicilian, obviously. Like, what
Yeah,
else would
exactly.
it
I
be?
mean, it's actually, I think, an example which is pertinent to explaining the chess findings, which I can get into in a moment, but which is a little bit more accessible to everybody, is imagine you had somebody gave you a list of letters with gaps. Maybe some of the characters might be spaces, but just essentially a chain of letters, and it's a random chain of letters, and perhaps it's maybe something like 80 characters long. Think about how hard it would be to firstly read that chain of letters. Like if they expose you to that chain of letters for 10 seconds or 15 seconds, you'd have no chance to remember that chain. It's just not possible. If it's just like AG9, well, maybe not digits, but AG, F, Z, X, U, like what the hell is that, right? Like there's nothing you can do with it, right? And on the other hand, if somebody exposed you to the letters in the form, we believe these truths to be self-evident, and that together is maybe like 80 characters. I don't know how many characters it is, but the point is, by making it a sentence which is familiar to many people, not only a sentence, so firstly, it's a sentence, right? So you can understand it, right? So it has some kind of meaning, but also it's familiar. Excuse me. But also it's familiar. You've probably heard that sentence before. It has cultural relevance specifically in the United States. And it means that it's very easy to remember. Like it maps onto something you already know. It maps onto like the fact that you already know, like, you already know English, right? So you know how to understand the sentences in general, but it specifically maps onto some specific sentence that you've seen before. I could make a sentence like, we believe these truths not to be self-evident. That's also pretty easy to remember because it's a minor variation, and it's also a meaningful variation. Like you see that variation and it kind of strikes you with the significance of like, well, this is trying to, is this some sort of like rebuttal or some sort of parody? You have a sense of it meaning something. And this is quite similar, I think, or you can understand the situation with chess quite well on that basis. Somebody who just looks at letters and they've got no idea what these letters are, or like, they don't know what to do with this. Perhaps that would be someone who barely knows the rules of chess. So, they see this board, they don't even know how to interpret what the hell is going on. Somebody who perhaps knows words, but they've never heard the phrase, would be somebody who, maybe knows the rules and knows some chess, but it's essentially like I'd have to actually think of an example in English of just like a random sentence. Maybe just one of the sentences that we say in this recording. If we just get one of those sentences and somebody has to remember it, they're going to be okay with remembering it.
Ideally, one where we talk about the distinctions between schemas and mental representations full of words that somebody might not know.
Yeah,
It's like
for
they
example.
kind of know that. Yeah.
Yeah, so somebody who is a really experienced chess player will see many of these positions, and just because they're not only familiar, as in not only have they seen them before, but they also have significant meaning for them, because they'll know other things related to this position. For example, they'll have ideas of how this position may have come about. They'll have ideas about what might happen next in this position. They'll have ideas about who has the advantage and why, and what possible plans might be for each side, and what significant strategic and tactical features are there on this board right now. So they'll have all of those ideas, and it will all be connected together in a way that will lead to a large amount of significance for them, as in they'll have a sense of meaning about this board. As well as it just being familiar because they've seen it before. So this is partly why, and this is where the experiment comes in, famous experiment around chess, that you expose chess grandmasters to a chessboard for under, I don't remember the exact timing, but we're talking under 10 seconds. I think it might have been 5 seconds.
I think it was 5 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're able to, on a separate board, reconstruct the entire chess position. But they're not able to do that if you scramble the pieces completely into a position that's not actually either not legal or incredibly unlikely in chess. Then they're actually not able to do that that same task, because you end up breaking. It's effectively like you end up with a chain of random letters if you just scramble it, so like pieces are next to each other in ways that in chess might not even be possible to happen.
Yeah, it's you would take away all of the things they can recognize, all of the things they know, all of the things they have studied and practiced, and you give them things that look the same as a chessboard because it's the same kind of figures, but it's something that they've never seen before. And one of the things I find so interesting about this is, and this relates to that experiment, by the way, anybody who wants to look at that, it's by Adrian de Groot.
To Groot,
Who
yeah.
did
I've never
who did
found the original paper, but I know it's from 1965 because everyone always quotes like
yeah.
the Groot 1965.
So the thing I find so interesting about it is it's not like these expert chess players, these grandmasters, these international masters, like they look at the chessboard and then they have to think really hard. They're like, oh yeah, oh, it's like all these things you just mentioned, like who has the advantage? They just see that. It's just obvious to them who has the advantage. They will immediately have attention drawn to that one piece where they're like, oh, that piece is the most important here. They will immediately have three ideas pop into their brain, into their mind, where they're like, oh, this could be good, this could be good. And all of these things, they just see. It's not even like they have to work for that. And I think that's one of the things I want to kind of emphasize about mental representations is they're not just some abstract thing we can then use to think about situations, but actually they determine what we perceive, where a grandmaster will perceive meaningful constellations on the board where they are like, oh, this person has the advantage. I look at it and I'm like, well, there's a lot of pieces. Where they will look at the board and they will immediately be drawn to that one rook, where they're like, it's all about that one rook. I don't see that. Like, how on earth would I see that? So mental representations guide our perception. They then help us to think about the situation, and they then also help us to figure out better courses of action, but not because we have to work hard. It's just because it's there. It's contained within the mental representation.
Yeah. So in the case of chess, I do remember what the chunks were actually for that. They were known as perceptual chunks. So to do with perception, that when you view the board, you actually see multiple pieces together as a single unit. So much like if I say the words like, we believe these truths to be self-evident, you don't really remember it as TRUTHS. You remember it as truths, as in like you remember that word as a whole, because that word, you have basically something in your memory for that word, for that the entirety of that word, rather than splitting it up into individual letters. And similarly, they have something in their memory for the entirety of this position that has, a king and 3 pawns in it, or this little piece of thing going on in the corner, which has like a bishop and and a knight in it, for example. They actually, you know, they don't always have names for these things, but they may as well have names for them because of the familiarity. So that they call these things perceptual chunks, and that's part of what helps explain why their reasoning is different, because they're basically handling smaller amounts of larger things instead of handling larger amounts of small things. And then it's easier for them to understand the relationships between smaller amounts of larger objects than it is to deal with the relationships between a large amount of small objects.
Yeah, and I want to add something to that perceptual chunk, because it's not just an ability to perceive. It's not just like on the board they see, oh, this is two rooks and a bishop. I know that. But within that perceptual chunk that they are able to perceive, there is good courses of action where they immediately know, I need to look out for that. I have a friend who I'm playing chess with currently, because I played probably until a few months ago, I played 20 chess matches in my life, and I'm now playing a little bit, and I have a friend who's 2,200 rated, so slightly better than me, just minimally.
Yeah.
And it's so he has all of these things that during a game, if he's sitting next to me, he will tell me as this is a rule, this is a thing to look out for now. I'm like, how would I know? So one of the things that he might immediately say is like, make sure your rooks are on the black squares. If he sees that the other one has a figure that can attack the white squares, and he just sees these things. So it's within that perceptual chunk. There is actions, things to look out for, possible strategies on how to advance, things that he organizes his thinking towards that I don't have. I have none of them. I don't even perceive it. But when I perceive it because he tells me to, I don't have all of these actions, ideas, principles that I can draw on, which he does.
Yeah, I would say the example of keep your pieces on dark squares so they can't be attacked by the light squared bishop is slightly more like it's kind of more I'm not sure I'd call it a principle, but it is kind of more like a principle in the sense that there are some other things like that in chess where they're like more like top down. I suppose you can call it, you can compare top down and bottom up processing here. So the chunks are more like bottom up processing. It's like you see the board and it's impossible not to see these effectively words made of chess pieces. And one of the ways that we know that they're real, well, a couple of ways. One is, of course, that experiment where it's noted that when the chess player recreates the chessboard, they do it chunk by chunk. So they recreate not just any piece anywhere, but they recreate like this corner thing with the king and the pawns in it. They like recreate that whole thing at once. And then they think, okay, what else was there on the board? And then they recreate another whole thing at once. So, and different chess players will tend to recreate the same pieces, as in the same chunks. So that's the other reason why we know their reality is that experienced chess players tend to develop the same kinds of chunks. They tend to end up thinking of the board in similar units. So yeah, but then that's kind of like bottom up processing. But then there's also a top down processing element of effectively rules or principles that you consciously apply that that aren't based on just like looking at the board and things jumping out at you, but more based on you sort of applying this idea and thinking how it might apply in this case. So one example of this is that it's important to control the center. That's a principle in chess. Another example of this is you have to keep your king safe. Excuse me. Another example is you need to make sure your pieces are all doing something. You have a number of pieces, it's possible for them to sit around do nothing. You need to make sure they do something. So these sorts of principles, to some extent, obviously, they get kind of wired into your perception. Like you perceive a position as bad because all your pieces are useless and they're not doing anything, or you perceive a position as dangerous because your king is in danger. You know, there is some level of you know, you end up with some of these principles being ingrained in some of your perceptions as well. But they are things that you can apply top down. Whereas there's less of a, certainly much less of a top-down, much more of a bottom-up sense with things like perceptual chunks, where you're like, oh, this group of pieces. It's not something that necessarily somebody ever taught you. You've just seen that group of pieces a lot in this sorts of positions that you've had to reason about, and eventually it becomes like a meaningful unit to you.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me as a beginning, or like a beginner hobby chess player. Uh,
Mm,
it's like I can actually do the reasoning, the top down, okay,
mm,
but I literally in every single position I have to reason through every single piece because
yeah.
I don't know which piece is important. So I have to be like, I could do this. No, that's not smart. I could, but that I because I don't have the bottom up. I only
Mm,
have the I can try to use the rules I know to
yeah.
to do it.
Mm, yeah. Um, yeah, that, I mean, you could say that that is the thing that the major or the most time consuming distinguishing factor between experts and novices is that novices build up a lot of this stuff that ends up being bottom up. Sorry, excuse me, experts have a lot of this stuff which ends up being bottom up, whereas the top down stuff, it does take some time to teach, but compared to the amount of time it takes to develop all this bottom up kind of knowledge, it's relatively quick. Um, you could tell all the principles to a novice and it might take you a few hours, but it's going to take many, probably thousands of hours for them to develop all of the information that's effectively bottom up.
Yeah. And I found one of the things in your rules are slow, patterns are fast episode. I found one thing you said very interesting about uh, the thought process in novices and experts within chess players is still basically the same. You look at the board, you come up with a few ideas of what you could do, you think those ideas through, and you choose. It's just that the experts always choose better moves
Yeah.
when they do that. And it's that kind of speaks to this. I can do the bottom down thought process. Oh, what are optional moves? But I just don't see a lot of the good moves, which they just pick up on, which is with
Mm,
my friend sitting next to me. I'm like, I could do this and this and this. And he's like, oh, I actually only thought about this one move. Like I didn't
mm,
even think about anything else because it's the only one that makes sense. And
yeah, yeah,
he doesn't even think about that. It's just it's the only one single move that makes sense.
yeah.
Where I'm like, how would I know? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure I can't think of one on the fly, but I'm sure it's possible to think of an example about of that, about like somebody editing some English text. There might be a small number of edits that seem sensible to somebody who, you know, speaks English and kind of know, I mean, you wouldn't need much more than being able to speak English, but somebody who somehow could see the text and had a dictionary but didn't actually understand the meaning of anything that was going on, they could be like, well, I could edit all these other words, and then you'd be like, why are you trying to edit those words? That doesn't make, doesn't
Yeah.
do anything. Unfortunately, I can't think of an example on the fly of what that would be like. Excuse me. uh, yeah, so mm,
You would just be naturally drawn, especially if you're an expert editor. You would just pick up on it's that sentence that's unclear. Whereas you could look at every other sentence and be like, yeah, I can add that. But as an editor, you're like, all of this is okay, but this one sentence is
yeah,
funky. And
exactly.
you
You'd
just,
be like, oh, you've written a great thing, but then here it's, you know, you've made a long hard sentence that's hard to understand. So obviously we've got to tackle that. It's like you immediately home in on the problem.
yeah.
You immediately see the problem and you home in on it. Yeah. So the sorry, there was something I was going to say about the example that you gave. Oh yeah, sorry. So when I spoke about that podcast episode, actually something arose some months after I recorded that episode. So I discovered that it is a commonly so there are a few sort of small errors in the common understanding of chess expertise because of de Groot's research. So de Groot did some research with different levels of chess players, but they were actually all experts. This is something that a lot of people fail to, it's like a detail that a lot of people fail to notice about his research, that he did do, you know, some of his research was partly with grandmasters and partly with people whose rating was something like 2000. So if your rating is around 2000, you're
You're
you're a very good
absolutely, yeah.
player. Like that's close to master level, not grandmaster, but it's close to master level. But you are a very good player at 2000.
If you're rated 2000, you are better than 99 point something % of players.
Yeah, you're a very good player at 2000,
Yeah.
but a grandmaster is, you know, in a beginner, for context, a beginner might be rated somewhere around 1000, and a grandmaster would be rated around 2500 or so. So basically, you're closer to being a grandmaster than a beginner at level 2000. So he was effectively comparing experts against exceptional experts, I suppose we could call it. But people quote his research and fail to remember that detail, that we're not actually talking about the difference between novices and experts. We're talking about the difference between experts and really good experts. And so there are a couple of things that other people who've actually done the research down to the novice level have discovered that are different from the way that his research normally quoted and the things I was quoted in that podcast episode. One is that so the random positions where you like randomly distribute pieces on the board with no concern about the rules, and you just make this sort of abstract art of chess pieces on a chessboard basically, and you ask a chess player to memorize that. In de Groot's research, there was no difference between the lower and higher rated players in how well they did that task, but computer models indicated that there probably should be some kind of difference, even though it's small. And then when they tested this with beginners versus grandmasters, they did actually manage to measure a difference. It's not a huge difference, but grandmasters are better at remembering totally random positions than beginners, because what happens is that even if you make a completely random position, there are still relationships. Like if you made a completely random string of letters, you'd randomly have the word "the" appear somewhere, and it would help you remember.
And also, you're just probably even better at telling apart the figures. Like you are easily able to tell apart what's a rook and what's a bishop and what's a horse. Like you can actually just see that faster than somebody who hasn't trained that.
Yeah, so you've got these minor advantages which are not the, you know, it's not really representative of the core difference, but they still help you be slightly better at that task, and that has been found. And then another thing is this about the different ways that they think. So there is, you know, there's basically no difference in the way of thinking between an expert and an extreme expert, but there is there is a little bit more difference between a beginner and a grandmaster in terms of like how do they think about the game. So there is some kind of like, you know, how do I choose moves kind of thinking that varies, which is not that surprising really. When you think about it, like a beginner and a grandmaster probably should have a bit of difference there, but it's still not the dominating influence. Still the dominating influence is this thing about them being able to perceive what's really going on.
It's interesting. Like, yeah, it makes sense, and at the same time, it's probably not as. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. That's a very interesting thing to pick up on. And by the way, a beginner is not 1000 rated. Beginners, if you actually look online, beginners are like 300 to 500 rated, like actual beginners.
Maybe what I think of as a beginner is somebody who's like maybe played like 200 games rather than somebody who's played like 2 games.
So, well, you will have people stuck at 500, 600 for a while. Like it's not that easy to move ahead without really practicing. So you're probably thinking of like not a complete beginner, but somebody who's actually played for a bit. Like if you compare it to chess clubs, like in chess clubs, the beginners are like 1000 rated usually because they advance quite quickly. But if you just have people playing online who are actually just beginners kind of playing, it's pretty grim. Like I can tell you from experience.
Fair enough.
But so maybe what we can take away from this is how important these mental representations are for expertise, and that these mental representations are built up through experience, through repetition, through thinking, through studying, and that these mental representations then later on determine so much of the performance, and actually it determines it in these ways you wouldn't necessarily expect of a mental representation. Like they change our perception, they change our immediate impulses for action. They change all of that before we even think about it, which I think is where most people think about mental representations, that it comes from, oh, we then think about it and then we can act differently. It's like, no, it's baked into how we perceive and interact with whatever situation we're in when we're in our field of expertise.
Yeah, if you think about it as making sense, so if you see something happening in an everyday scenario, and I don't know, if you see like a policeman walking down the road and they've got like a roast turkey in a tray and they're just like carrying it around, it doesn't make sense. Like, why, that doesn't fit in my understanding of a normal situation, a normal part of their job or anything, right? So, and
So you
that's
would
because I have
figure
a
out
mental
you're in
representation of
America.
what. Sorry.
You would figure out you're in America and it's Thanksgiving.
Right. I'd start thinking thoughts like that. I'd be like, is it because it's like it would demand my attention. It would be like, this is unusual. What is it that is going on? And the reason that it demands my attention is because it goes against my mental representation, effectively, of what that person's job is or what I expect them to be doing. So it's effectively it's as simple as that. In the sense that rather than learning is to a large extent, it's making things familiar, and it's making things feel easy and normal, so that things make sense. And so for a chess player, chessboards kind of make sense. They see things and they immediately have interpretations of them, because it's like, to some extent, it's like speaking to them in language a little bit, or it's like looking at a scene on a street and thinking, is this like a normal scene, or is this a scene where a fight's going to break out, or is this a scene where, like, so there's something odd in this picture. That's something that we can determine just because we have a lot of experience of walking around outside. And they've got it's slightly it's slightly more complicated than having a lot of experience looking at chessboards, because it is possible to keep on playing chess and not improving. But as a kind of shorthand, roughly speaking, they've seen a lot of chessboards, and it helps them see these things that other people just wouldn't be able to see.
Yeah. They've seen these chessboards and they've thought about them in a specific way. That's usually where the improvement comes from. I would love to make a small jump, if that's okay for you, because
No
if we kind of take this chess mental representation, you've brought in the walking around the street, and also that we have mental representations there. One of the fields I'm currently thinking about a lot, and I know that we're going to exit more that this is the very thorough research of chess, and we're going to get into slightly more trying to draw analogies and conclusions from other fields to think about them. But I would love to talk about music, because so one of the projects I'm involved in is designing a program of teaching music that works differently than the kind of traditional approach that of how teaching music has been done for a long time. And we can talk about that later maybe, or we'll figure it out. But I think a lot of what I've been trying to make sense of is, what are the mental representations that successful or like expert musicians use to do what they do well. And one of the things I find really interesting, which I draw from the Anders Ericsson Peak book, is that actually Anders Ericsson, who's kind of the godfather of expertise research, like he's founded that field, and his ideas have permeated very deeply, even though, as far as I understand, they also kind of get challenged a little bit more by now. He's kind of taken a lot of his ideas of how expertise is developed from actually studying musicians, but studying a very particular group of musicians, which is the violin players within the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. And he studied them to figure out what made these violin players better than other violin players who'd also practiced a lot. And the main thing he came away from has been practice, and a specific kind of practice, being this deliberate practice, which is actually something that they don't really find enjoyable, but they do anyways.
Yes.
And so number one, so maybe I just stop talking for a moment. And do you want to add anything to the picture of Anders Ericsson music I've been painting
Sure,
so
lots. I've got so
yeah,
I could
go
talk
for
for
it.
like 20 minutes,
Just
man. No, you're giving me too much there. So Anders Ericsson is one topic, music is another topic, and deliberate practice is a third topic. So there are lots of directions to go. Yeah, Anders Ericsson is one of the main figures in the field. He passed away a few years ago. He's a great psychologist. His basically he promoted this idea of deliberate practice as being not only the key, but to some extent the only factor that really matters in developing expertise. And that's been challenged by a number of people recently in the past. I don't remember exactly how many years, maybe like in the past 10 years or 8 years or something. It's been challenged because there's some research to indicate that actually other things also matter. But basically, yeah, this kind of practice is important. And one other reason why it's a bit contentious is that when you look into other fields, if you expand your view into many different fields, you often find that deliberate practice is varies quite a lot between fields, and sometimes it's difficult to define in a particular field as like what are they doing that we would call deliberate practice. And as a result, it makes the whole thing a bit less clear, because it's like if you can say that there's a thing called deliberate practice in music, but then it doesn't work the same way in other fields, then what are you really talking about? Like you can't
and
really pin it
I
down
would
very
I
well.
would personally, and maybe we come there in a moment, but I would personally even say that within the field of music, deliberate practice is probably only applicable in this specific way to classical music.
Exactly.
And I find that super interesting to think
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. That's the third angle on this, is that he's looking at classical musicians. I mean, a specific instrument in classical music, but we know from other research that it seems that pianists are in a similar kind of boat here with classical pianists. Um, but he's looking at these classical musicians, but there are many other traditions of music, and as it turns out, culturally speaking, classical music is unusual among musical cultures, and both in terms of its appreciation and composition, and but also in terms of the way it's played and in terms of the way it's learned. So if you're only looking at classical musicians, you're not really looking at the whole, you're certainly not looking at the whole field. You're looking almost at like an extreme case of the
Yeah.
field. And then when you look at other types of music, then things look a little bit different, and also with the deliberate practice part.
And then once you get outside of music and you get into all the different fields, there's so much variance in how people learn and what it actually takes to become an expert, that deliberate practice is not everything.
Yeah. So in particular, it's I mean, the main thing that's contentious about deliberate practice is the idea that it's inherently not enjoyable. And and that has been challenged the most, because there are certain fields where people who are experts in those fields don't report not enjoying what you would call their deliberate practice. So it seems to be in some fields more so than others. You have to push yourself in ways that it's just not very fun. Whereas in other fields, it doesn't seem to be like that as much. For context, I've read research about a very large range of fields. I've read research about tennis players, piano players, basketball players, hockey players, football players, um, musicians, rock musicians, a little bit about jazz musicians. I've read research about like professional wrestlers and ice skaters, and lacrosse players, and yeah, I mean it's sports and music feature a lot, but also chess. Excuse me, also chess and writers and entrepreneurs, and like there's a lot of different variation you can look at in terms of people who are good at things, right? Experts.
I
And
mean,
when
you could even
sorry?
look at such examples. I don't know if they've been studied, but like skateboarders, they do they are definitely doing deliberate practice because they're consciously working on their next trick. But it's so fun to them that they're willing to destroy their body just to learn a trick that they will never get paid for. Like,
Yeah.
so there are such different fields. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I partly mentioned that I've looked into lots of different, partly to just say that there's lots of different angles to look at, but partly to say that this might be why I'm worried I'm going to quote the wrong sport now, but I think it was wrestling, where they found that it was just an example of a field where they found that they really enjoyed the wrestling. You know, they really enjoyed practice, and that was one of this author was like, I'm trying to get this to line up with Anders Ericsson's research, but it doesn't quite line up because they enjoy it. So is it really deliberate practice? So where's the deliberate practice? And that was kind of like the conclusion of their article. Part of their conclusion was like, what's going on with the deliberate practice here? More research is needed, you know, and you see that in a few different fields.
Yeah. I mean, I think in your pop musicians podcast, you mentioned the Restless. So I think it was the Restless. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot also in regards to music is so Anders Ericsson has studied music quite a bit, and as far as I can look at the expertise literature, he's done a lot of the study in music. And he's kind of looked at music and he's talked about, so which part of music can we actually study? And we can study the classical musicians because there's a clear ranking as to who's the best and who's not. And that's unfortunately not the case for things like pop music, which I would find interesting because actually you can rank that based on who sells the most and things like that. So you could do like rankings, but they would look differently. I'm just as a thing, but I think the element of it I find so interesting is that he's then tried to extract. So what are the mental representations here that are used for these expert classical musicians? And in his peak book, he talks about it as this one expert pianist who's learning a new piece for a performance she has. And he's talking about, oh, look at these mental representations. They're so highly developed and they allow her to perform. And he, for instance, goes through, so number one, when she gets this new piece she has to learn, she'll sight read it. And then kind of in a little sentence, he mentions, wow, and she can sight read it, and it's almost like she can hear it in her own head just from sight reading it. Oh, by the way, she's heard this piece many times before. So it's like, so number one, she has this really interesting, she has heard the piece a lot of times. So that's actually a mental representation already. She has knowledge of the piece just based on having heard it many times. And then when she reads it, she has the skill of being able to read the notes. And while she reads it, she can in her head kind of listen along and see what is she reading right now. And then while she reads it, she can already, without playing, figure out how will she have to do the fingering in these different parts. And she realizes, oh, I can use my normal fingering here, but here I will have to do something special. And she can just see that. She doesn't even have to play that. And then through practice, she will turn the piece into this landscape of normal fingering, advanced fingering. She will have earmarks in the piece where she knows when I'm playing this, I have to prepare for changing my fingering. And the whole piece turns into this very densely structured representation in her that she can then perform. And I found that really interesting because number one, you can see, yes, she has to have the skill to play like that, but also she has to have all of those representations to actually learn to play the piece in a performance setting. But then the second thing, when I read that, is like, there's basically only classical musicians who play music like that, who play music in that very, very strict way of, I get this, then I practice it and I play it exactly as it is written there. And all my effort goes into reproducing it perfectly. And yeah.
The sight reading has been studied quite a lot by people who study musicians. There's a particular researcher of this called John Sloboda. Can't remember his university, somewhere in the UK. And he's done the bulk of the research on it. But yeah, sight reading is something that it's just one of these things where, you know, people are trying to be scientists. They want to do things that are measurable. They want to control variables as much as they can. And this is part of the reason why Anders Ericsson liked the idea of using the violinists, because if there's a ranking, it means that you can feel that you're being more objective about who is actually counts as highly expert. Otherwise, it feels like you might be being subjective, and it might ruin your attempt to be scientific about this. So sight reading is one of these things where you can measure, you know, how you do things like you give them a sheet of music, and then you suddenly remove the sheet of music from their eyes, and you see how much they continue playing. And then you can see, well, more expert musicians, they actually continue playing for, you know, a further 5 notes or 10 notes. So they're actually reading ahead. And that's like one thing that you can do, because you can set up that experiment. And there are many other experiments that they do to check this.
Yeah, with sight reading, it's also about, can they play the piece exactly as it's written multiple times over? So like,
yeah, or if you provide the piece, but you alter some of the notes. So like, I think the way they did this experiment is you provide a piece, and then you ask them to play it again, but you actually provide you alter some of the notes so that they're really weird. Or maybe it was that, like, you provide the notes for the piece, and it's a familiar, where it's like, you know, in a familiar style or something, but you put some really weird notes in weird places, or you alter some of it, and more expert musicians get that more wrong. Like, if you're less expert, you get it more right, because more expert musicians will rely more on their internal representation of what the music's supposed to sound like. Whereas less expert musicians will have less of a strong representation for that, so they'll have to rely more on reading. So anyway, they do a bunch of experiments like this, but I guess I'm not sure if this is the bottom line, but it's an important aspect is that sight reading doesn't apply to most musicians. It only applies to classical musicians, because the majority of musicians in the world are quote unquote illiterate, as in they don't use sheet music. Rock musicians don't use it. Jazz musicians don't use it. Well, I mean, some jazz musicians do, but not all jazz musicians do. You know, various other kinds of what you might call casual or non-formal music don't require sheet music. People learn things from the sound. I don't imagine pop musicians write out sheet music for themselves to learn. Possibly they do, but I think it's quite likely they don't. It seems from what I've read that generally they don't. So most musicians aren't using sheet music. So it's a field that, it's a type of study that applies specifically to a very particular tradition, and it just doesn't apply to most musicians.
Yeah. And this for me is one of the things I've been really kind of munching on because one of the things that, due to my stint into teaching music, I've looked at a lot is it doesn't apply to most musicians. Like, most musicians use different types of orientation than the classical musician. And those orientations would be key. And knowing with this key, what are the tones that go along, the notes that go along, what are the chords that fit this, what would be rhythmic structures that fit whatever is played. Like, all of those would be mental representations that pop musicians would use, that jazz musicians would use, that blues musicians would use, and they would organize their internal musical landscape around that. So when you have an experienced musician and an experienced jazz or pop musician, and you give them a song they don't know, what they will immediately do is, like, they try to figure out what's the main note, okay? And then they figure out what is oh, it's a D. And then they're like, oh yeah, and they play, oh, it's a D major. And then as soon as they know it's a D major, they know, okay, so it's going to be these notes. And they know, as a D major, this is going to be a major chord, this is going to be a minor chord, this is going to be a minor chord, that's going to be a major chord. They're going to know, like, in 90% of the cases, that's it. But sometimes there are these inversions, like where this chord is a major instead of a minor, and this chord is a minor instead of a major happens. They kind of know that. And then based on that, they can follow the song, and they're like, oh yeah, so they use that. Yeah. but they already have an expectation, oh, it's probably going to be a G now. Oh, it's a C. Interesting. Okay. But their mental representation has given them all of that information so that they then know the song. The interesting thing is a lot of classical musicians cannot do that because they never learned that. They learned follow this, but they didn't learn figure it out. Like nobody ever gave them the mental representations to just figure it out. If they play long enough, which is usually like 5, 6, 7 years, they also learn that. But if you had a classical musician who played for 3 years, and they might be really good at playing, at sight reading and playing, they may have no idea how to listen and play along to a song because they don't have the mental representations for that. And I find that super interesting that there seems to be that gap, and that at least here in Germany, and I don't know how it is in other countries, most children, especially when they learn the violin or the piano, they will be taught the way a classical musician is taught. So they will be given notes, and then they will have to play along to the notes. And so they're not only learning the instrument, but they're also learning this weird language that they then have to play along to. And so we kind of pretend like in the end, everybody's going to be a classical musician, or that at least that's the best way to train children at first. When actually, like most people who do music long term will not be classical musicians. They will play in bands and they will jam with friends and they will need these other tools.
Yeah, I think one thing I just want to clarify in case it might have been misunderstood is that it's not so much that musicians who aren't classical musicians scorn sheet music. That does happen sometimes. Some people say, I think reading music is just fundamentally bad, but that's a relatively small proportion of non-classical musicians. There are lots of non-classical musicians who actually really like the idea of writing and reading music. It's just because it's not a common way that they use to learn or teach or communicate. So it's just not relevant for them during their learning period. And a lot of the time they will say afterwards, after many years of being in music, they'll be like, well, one sort of regret I have, or one thing I wish I could learn to read or write music. So it's more a question of it's just not relevant to their practices, rather than it's that they think that there's something inherently wrong with it. But yeah, what you're saying, I mean, basically these two fields have different goals, and you see this sometimes that in some fields that seem related, that they're different, because if you set different goals, you end up following different practices because you have different goals. You're trying to achieve those different goals. In classical music, you're trying to recreate a repertoire and do it exactly and precisely correctly. And in jazz music, it's not like that. You're trying to do something very different to that. There's some research. This is more of feels more like an anecdote because it's just one piece of research, but I found it really kind of inspiring or enlightening. The idea that they did brain scans on musicians as they were playing, and they found that comparing classical musicians against jazz musicians, classical musicians have like some sort of area in their brain is active to do with repression, which basically like it's the kind of area that would be involved in doing things like ensuring that you're very polite, or making sure you don't make any mistakes. And that area is much less active or largely inactive in jazz musicians as they play, and that seems to just kind of be a reflection of what we're talking about. That classical musicians are trying to play the music and play it right, whereas jazz musicians it doesn't matter to them as much if they do something quote unquote wrong. They're just trying to follow the sense of the music and make it sound good, and there's much less of a strict sense of what's correct and incorrect, or a sense of sort of blame for you failed in your task because you played the incorrect note. That's not really the culture of jazz or the culture of many other types of music. Whereas in classical music, there's much more of a sense of like, well, you're learning this music so you can go to a classical music competition and play the music in front of everyone. Make sure you play the notes right.
And everybody goes, but only claps at the end. And yeah, I think what you're saying is really correct. It's a different goal. But what I found so interesting about it, and why I find it also so highly relevant to this idea of talking about mental representations, is that a jazz pianist and a classical pianist both play the piano. And
Mm,
they may even be technically excellent. And at the same time, it might be, at least if they've both been like trained very purely in the sense of a jazz pianist has only done jazz and a classical pianist has only done classic, you might be able to put the classical pianist in a jazz session and they just can't do shit because they're like, I don't even know what you're doing. They don't
mm,
have the representations to even follow along and to figure out how do I play to this. And a jazz musician might be sitting there in front of the sheet music and be like, what do I do here?
mm,
So it really shows this importance of, it's not just the skill, it's not just that I can use my hands this way. It's the framework and the mental representation that they have built up that allows them to do that allows them to use that skill in a specific way. And I
mm,
actually find that super fascinating and a very interesting example of how specific these mental representations are. They're not
mm,
just music, they are more specific than that.
mm. Yeah, absolutely.
And the big question that I also have with regarding to this with teaching now is, so if I'm a teacher, for instance, of music, I would have to ask myself, what's the goal for this student? What kind of music should they play at the end?
Hmm.
And then I should choose, so they need these kind of mental representations. And then I should choose, so these are the practices that will build these mental representations.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Usually people will make that decision on the basis of a given culture that they are preparing this student for. So, you know, for instance, classical music has its own culture and hip hop has a different culture. And, you each culture has its own practices and values, and you're for the most part, you're following whatever they are.
yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, yeah, I think the thing I'm so fascinated with in this is, if we look down, or if we connect with teachers and teaching and learning, it's how specific you actually have to be as a teacher. Like how specific you, there is no, this is the way you teach music.
Mm,
Even within music, there is, this is the way you teach music for this goal. And you have to be clear on what's the goal, where's the student at, what's the next step for the student. And all of these things go into your decision. And I think when we then look at fields that are maybe less established than music, how much of all of this gets lost in teaching because we don't even have the capacity to think about what's the mental representation I want to build here. And when we don't think about that, we will often teach stuff that's just not important, that's just not relevant, and that's just not goal oriented in the sense of this gives people the steps to really learn something.
well, you can think of teaching in general as the transmission of culture. Um, in that, I've spoken before on the podcast. You mentioned the thing about when I spoke about what learning is. So, uh, very briefly, it's about adding things to people's long-term memory. Effectively, is or altering people's long-term memory is effectively what learning is, and so if we think of culture as like a set of knowledge and practices and values associated with a particular group of people, then the transmission of culture is getting somebody else to have those values. I mean, it's weird to think about values in people's long-term memory, but I suppose maybe it's okay. But more precisely, the knowledge and the practice, the experiences for those to be in their long-term memory effectively. I feel like I'm sort of trying to bridge between a kind of large scale thinking about humanity level, culture level, and like a smaller scale, like cognitive science level when I make that claim. But if we think about it at that level, that really what we're doing is we're trying to transmit culture. If we're trying to teach somebody to play the piano is a cultural object. It has it's a tool created by humans within a particular part of the world. It's become quite international, but you might not find it in the Amazon rainforest. So it's a tool created by people within a particular culture or set of cultures, with a particular expectations about the way that it's used, what it's used for, and also like what's good about being, like, what does it mean to be a good pianist? Well, you're going to get a different answer if you're a classical or a jazz pianist. You get a different answer because effectively these are two different cultures. So two different cultures have different values, and then they play the music in different ways, and they have different expectations, and the skills that they end up developing reflect the values that they have. So yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense from the perspective of thinking of it as a kind of cultural transmission, or a
So
cultural, maybe not necessarily. You could use the word transmission. You could use the idea of like sort of bringing somebody into a culture, like making them an insider of your culture, kind of thing.
so I really like that perspective, in the sense of learning and teaching is always more than just the skills and knowledge. It has to be embedded in a deeper, what is this for?
Mm-hmm.
And the what is this for has to be meaningful in itself. Like, you can
Yeah.
teach the greatest skills in the world if people don't have a sense of meaning with it, and a sense of who who will I become when I embody and do this,
Mm-hmm.
then it won't lead anywhere. So actually, within any musical, and we take music as an example, within any musical training, there's always the question of, what does this give you? Like, what can you partake in with this?
Mm. Who do I become? That's a fantastic question. That's a fantastic question. And I think a very good teacher, aside from being effective, is somebody who can convincingly make people feel that they have the answer to that question, or feel that they are both asking and answering that question of like, who am I trying to become, is something that they're aware of as an idea, and like, I am specifically trying to become this. It's inspiring to lots of people to have that idea in their heads, and it also makes clear what you're trying to do. I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is a bit of a tangent, but I think this is part of the reason that for many, many, many years I've been quite confused about how to think about certain parts of school education, because who are we trying to make people become when we teach them basic or semi-basic mathematics, like algebra or something? um I suppose in a way that question is behind part of my confusion about certain things that we learn in school, because if it was if I felt like I had a very clear answer for that question, um then I would be satisfied. And I feel like there is less of a society-wide or culture-wide answer to that question. And it makes me feel a bit lost, because in other aspects of my own personal life and education, I've had a very clear idea of what I wanted to become. And the reasons that I'm putting in much effort into learning things has always been because I have an idea of like, I want to become this, I want to be like this. Um, and even in learning mathematics, I mean, for me personally, I had like, I want to become a person who knows mathematics, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Right. But just the idea of teaching others and thinking like, well, if you don't have that conviction, like, I'm not sure how I'm going to give you that conviction. I kind of, that's kind of a thing that is, it's part of the reason that I've been motivated to investigate education, is because of those kinds of discomforts that I've had about like not knowing what identity I wanted to propose to people, or what I think they would be able to accept, or kind of that, basically that question of, who are you going to become? Who should you become? Who are we going to make you become?
And if we ask that question in the education context, in the like school context,
Mm-hmm.
I think there are actually quite a lot of things to learn that where that answer is really obvious. It's like, you should know basic math because otherwise you're an incapable human and that's not good. You should
Mm.
know how to read because
Yeah.
without reading, there is a whole world of things that just doesn't open to you that is very important. But
Mm.
then at certain points where it's like you need to learn how to do certain mathematical proofs, where
Mm.
it's like that might be relevant for some people, but it's really not relevant for many others.
Right.
And and how does this make you become a better human?
But some people will feel that it does, I wouldn't say that it's a question that's just, it's not that the question has a clear answer of it doesn't do anything for you. It's more that it's like there's both a large amount of societal investment in making it happen because all children are made to do it, but also a lack of societal cultural clarity on like why is this a thing that we care about. And that's been confusing for me. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a tangent from the music thing because I think
No,
in
I find it
music,
really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, in music it's clearer because in music it's like people enjoy music. That's as far as it goes. People play music, it inspires them, it makes them have a happy time. They
But
get to
but
enjoy it.
actually, if we were to break it down to music, I think there is a reason why. And I mean, I've been kind of in this bubble now of also talking to lots of people who, number one, who did learn music at some point in time and who quit because they were frustrated with especially the classical approach of like who was sitting there going like, why should I learn how to read this and recreate this? I don't want to do that.
Mm,
Like so for them that was not meaningful. And
mm,
actually, the second group of people, I've talked to a number of them by now who like as in their youth, they had 10 years of musical classes and they were actually excellent at the piano. But if you now sit them at a piano, they are like, I don't know anything because all I know is how to play these pieces I once learned.
mm,
But I can't interact with anybody on the piano. I can't learn this pop piece I want to learn because I've never done that. So for
mm,
them, it's like their musical journey actually lacked some of the meaning that they might have had in a jazz context or in a blues context. So actually, I think there might be a place of some of the music education has also become so specialized that it is highly meaningful for some people, but maybe societally not as meaningful anymore because classical music isn't that big of a thing anymore.
mm,
Whereas actually learning how to jam with your friends. And if every kid just knew how to like play enough of an instrument to join a band and to join a band practice, that might be
mm.
way more meaningful than I can play Chopin really well.
Yeah. I mean,
Who
in the
knows?
end, if these things are if these things are part of government provided schools, then it's always going to be difficult to like come up with some like it's never easy for a bureaucracy to inspire people, right? uh
No, I think it's kind of the opposite.
exactly, right. so so yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Like, I'm not going to like point fingers at people and saying like it's your fault for not being inspiring. Like, I mean, it's a bureaucracy. Like, what are you going to do? I think, on the whole, probably like, it's a different conversation, but it's probably better for school to exist than for it not to exist. I mean, it's a bigger conversation to go into that in detail, but yeah, it's a lot of education is at that scale, and I guess it's partly just a question of, you know, this is the way that culture works, that there is kind of like a set way of doing things, and well, kind of a set way of thinking about things and doing things. There are always going to be people who are a little bit, there are always going to be people who are sort of more um accepting of whatever the current culture promotes, or whatever the culture they find themselves in promotes. Other people are going to find it harder to accept. But also, the example that you gave of the student who had 10 years of experience, but they felt like they couldn't play because they found it difficult to do things outside of their memorized pieces. I mean, I think this is a thing where it's like sometimes we have the issue shades between the cultural side and the cognitive side, because it might be that, you know, you could have somebody have probably similar levels of achievement, where had you taught them in a different way, they would have a deeper understanding of the actual how it musically works. Like, it's possible to teach somebody by rote so much for so many years that effectively the main a key problem in why they're in that situation is because there's been a lot of rote learning happening in the absence of sense making. So like perhaps if they were in, essentially the same musical culture, but there was a teaching method, they were taught in such a way where they actually made sense of the music more than simply rote learning everything that they ever encountered. They might find themselves in a better position. So that's more of a cognitive issue than a cultural issue, though.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I actually think the sense-making issue in music is a huge one because a lot of at least the traditional classical study is not made for sense-making. It's made for technique. And there's enough sense-making to improve technique, but that's about it. Whereas I think with more sense making, people would probably also find more meaning in it because they would suddenly have more freedom with how they use it. And yeah, that's a whole thing of where we're quite consciously working on what are the levels of sense making of mental representations we want to give to students so that they know why they're doing what they're doing, so that they can play with it, which is in a lot of classical schools, they will learn that after they've been in the school for like 5 years. But before that, it's mostly like you just need to learn this first, and then we can talk about it. Which obviously for a lot of students will be quite quickly, why am I doing this? Like this is not fun. Why am I playing the scales? What's that? What's that even for? So I think it's a big conversation. Yeah, Stas, I've gone through the things I wanted to go through with you. This has
Fantastic.
been very, very helpful to me.
I
Anything
enjoyed it very
you
much.
want to add?
Nothing comes to mind. I think we hit a lot of interesting points. I think it's a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah. I also really, just as a last point, I really like your distinction on the rote learning and sense making, and that you need some maybe not rote learning, but you need some memorization for a lot of things. But you always need to embed it in a larger net of sense making. And
Yeah.
where are the limits of each of them? Because you can't make sense without the facts, but facts without the sense making are meaningless.
Yeah, it's tricky because a lot of people will rail against rote learning, which is fair, but if they rail against it to the point where they're like, we never really need to teach any facts, or we never need to do anything which involves practice, or do anything which it looks in any way similar to memorization, then they're essentially casting out a really useful, sometimes close to essential tool for
Yeah.
learning. To think of memorization as a tool for learning, which if used exclusively is a really terrible idea, but if used judiciously, it can be very important for your learning. Is the best way to think about it. But a lot of people will just be so fed up with rote learning that they will consider it to be evil in all cases, which is an overextension, I would say.
Yeah. There is actually one perfect example from the world of music because I've looked into it so much now with also kind of trying to figure out how do most people teach this. And in music, there would be one fundamental thing that you need to rote learn and that actually makes everything else easier, which would be just the note names, which would be like,
Right.
once you know that it's a, what is it called?
A sharp.
A sharp. Yeah,
Yeah.
sharp is the word. B, C, C sharp. Once you know that, which there's not very many ways you can make sense of that, but once you know that, you can suddenly apply that to every instrument.
Well, it's the same
And
with the alphabet. Like, there's no
yeah,
making sense of the letter A's shape sounding like A. It's completely arbitrary. You have to
yes,
memorize the alphabet, but who's going to deny a child the opportunity to memorize the alphabet? If you
exactly.
do
But
that, you're essentially saying, I want you to be illiterate for your whole life, right? You have to memorize the alphabet. But once it's memorized, you can make progress on learning to read, and things eventually get very meaningful.
But the really interesting thing I've found, and I've now talked to multiple kind of music teachers and people who've studied this, that in many contexts, there's literally 12 notes. So there would be 12 bits of information you need to learn. A sharp. And it often takes students up to 2 years to learn that because it's introduced so slowly and so bit by bit that it may be 2 years until they know all of the note names. Which from a cognitive perspective of once you know it, you can use it, doesn't make any sense. But that's the way it's taught, so that things are just spread out so much that rather than learning the pattern once and then applying it, it takes you 2 years to learn the pattern. Just fascinating, isn't it? Like to think about it, it's 12 bits of information. Like, how can that take 2 years?
Well, it's because they're not. It seems that it doesn't factor as a goal of theirs to
Exactly.
prioritize that, basically.
Yeah. Which I just that's one of those bits of information where I'm like, that's so fascinating. Like, that's so
If they
fascinating.
prioritize it, then give it like a week or something. I don't know how long, 2 weeks maybe, and they'd be totally on top of it.
Yeah.
You never know what's around the next corner.